to survive betrayal at the hands of those who were supposed to protect her, because no one survives in a royal court by being innocent for long. As Isabella's carriage rolled into London streets lined with cheering crowds, her young face stared out through the embroidered silk of the procession canopy, trained not to react, not to smile too much, not to weep. For the home she'd left behind, for beneath the velvet robes and jeweled headdresses, court life was a theater of knives. Behind the smiles were whispered alliances. Beneath the polished floors of Westminster rotted the bones of queens who had failed their kings, and Isabella knew, even at 12, that failure could mean exile, madness, or death. The English court was in turmoil. Edward II had elevated Piers Gaveston, a handsome and arrogant Gascon knight, to positions of power and prestige usually reserved for the queen consort. Gaveston not only dominated the king's affections, but mocked the English nobility in tournaments and masquerades, calling them by obscene nicknames and dressing in flamboyant silks that rivaled Isabella's own wardrobe. It was no secret that the king's heart belonged to another, and Isabella quickly realized that she had been married not into partnership but into rivalry. The humiliation was constant. Her royal budget was slashed while Gaveston was showered with gifts, her requests ignored while his whims became law. But Isabella was her father's daughter, and the blood of Philip the Fair ran cold and calculating through her veins. She watched, she waited, and she learned Isabella began to cultivate relationships with the powerful earls who resented Gaveston's influence. She sent quiet letters to her father describing her isolation, her intelligence cloaked in the passive veil of a child queen playing the long game in a court ruled by short tempers and sharp steel. When Gaveston was finally exiled by order of Parliament, Isabella's dowry was used to pay his travel expenses when he returned in defiance of the king's promises. It was Isabella's family that raised armies against him, her name whispered through the corridors of power as both pawn and player. When Gaveston was captured and executed by the king's own barons, Isabella made no public statement, but privately she began to assert her authority, demanding the return of her full household rights, reinstating her French ladies-in-waiting, and commissioning religious manuscripts with her name inscribed in gold leaf, no longer merely the king's consort. She was now the mother of England's future. For by age 16, Isabella had produced an heir, a boy who would become Edward III, a child born of necessity but raised with the fierce protection or of a mother who knew too well what it meant to be abandoned by the man who shared her crown but not her bed. Isabella's greatest challenge came not from Edward's lovers, but from Edward himself. Increasingly unhinged, paranoid, and politically incompetent, he lavished titles and estates on a new favorite, Hugh Despencer, a ruthless and greedy noble who alienated nearly every faction of the English court. Isabella was once again pushed aside, her lands seized, her allies imprisoned. Despencer even accused her of treason and urged the king to confiscate her jewels, the very ones gifted by her father as part of her dowry. This was no longer a cold war of courtly slights, it was open tyranny, and Isabella, now in her late 20s, transformed from survivor to strategist. She brokered a truce with the French court, securing safe passage to Paris under the pretext of a diplomatic mission, but she had no intention of returning alone. In France, she met Roger Mortimer, an exiled English noble with his own vendetta against Edward. Their alliance quickly deepened into both political conspiracy and intimate partnership. Together, they raised an army, not of mercenaries, but of exiled lords, disillusioned knights and commoners weary of Despencer's brutal regime. When Isabella landed on English soil in 1326, she was no longer the frightened girl forced into marriage, but a queen returning to reclaim her throne. The invasion was swift and near bloodless. Edward and Despencer fled. Their own subjects refused to fight for them when the pair were captured. Isabella oversaw Despencer's execution personally, The method chosen, hanging, drawing, and quartering, the most agonizing death permitted by English law. His genitals cut off and burned before his eyes, his heart torn out and flung into the fire. A message not only to traitors, but to anyone who underestimated the she-wolf of France. Edward II was imprisoned, forced to abdicate in favor of his son, and quietly murdered soon after his death, shrouded in rumors of red-hot pokers and royal vengeance. A chilling end to a king who had traded his queen for flatterers and lost everything. Isabella now ruled as regent for her young son, wielding power with a decisiveness that astonished her former enemies. She restructured the court, stabilized the economy, and instituted reforms that would outlive her brief regency. But the wheel of history turns without mercy, and power once seized must eventually be relinquished. Mortimer, drunk on influence, made the same mistake as Despenser, and began to rule through terror, imprisoning rivals and enriching himself at the crown's expense. Isabella saw the warning signs too late. Her son, now 16, turned against them in a palace coup. Both were arrested. Mortimer was executed for treason, and Isabella imprisoned for life in Castle Rising, a fortress as cold and silent as the girl she once was. They say she wandered the halls talking to herself, clutching relics of her lost childhood, whispering in French to the portraits that no longer listened to her. Owing comfort, a prayer book inked in gold, and the memory of a life stolen, then reclaimed, then lost again. For in the end, Isabella was not just a queen. She was a mirror of her age, brutal, cunning, loyal only to survival. Her story, not a cautionary tale, but a testament to how far a child forced into a crown can fall, and how fiercely she will rise before the silence claims her again. They say that history remembers victors, but it also fears the ones it cannot quite explain, the ones whose rise defies their beginnings, whose crimes were never confessed, and whose silence lingers centuries after their names were scratched into the stone of royal tombs. Isabella of France, once the frightened child queen in a foreign land, ended her life not with the glory of a ruler, nor the peace of a widow, but as a prisoner of memory. Yet even in her downfall, the echoes of her choices rippled across Europe. For her son, Edward III, watched her every move, not as a boy watches a mother, but as a future king studies power. What he learned from Isabella was more than politics. He learned fear. He learned that even a queen, even a mother, could raise armies and bring down a throne. And so, from the shadows of her legacy, a new kind of monarchy was born. One that masked cruelty in pageantry and buried dissent in legend. But Isabella was far from alone in this theater of brutal survival. Her world, the medieval royal court, was a gallery of women caged in velvet and ambition. Queens, princesses, and noble daughters across Europe were raised like rare birds, beautiful, delicate, bred for display and sacrifice. Take, for example, Joanna of Naples, crowned at just 15, who spent her life surrounded by whispers that she had ordered her first husband strangled in their marriage bed. Or Margaret of Anjou, wife of England's Henry VI, who was mocked as a foreign interloper and a she-wolf in her own right. A woman forced to lead armies when her husband slipped into madness and let the kingdom rot. And there was Eleanor of Aquitaine, centuries before Isabella, who married 2 kings, led a rebellion against her own husband, and spent 16 years imprisoned for daring to speak with her own voice. These were not tales of courtly love or chivalric devotion. These were stories of women made dangerous by desperation. History tried to call them villainesses, harlots, witches, but what they really were survivors of a game they never chose to play. In the medieval world, a royal woman's worth was measured not in wisdom, not in strength, but in her womb, her ability to bleed, to conceive, to birth sons who could carry on a dynasty. Her every pain was politicized. Miscarriages were national tragedies. Stillbirths were seen as divine judgment. And if she failed to produce an heir, she was cast out like spoiled meat. They examined queens with midwives and churchmen alike, looking for signs of fertility, like priests probing entrails for omens. They bled them, fed them strange concoctions of deer marrow and powdered pearls, and prayed over their bellies with relics of saints. Some were subjected to humiliating public rituals, paraded before bishops to affirm their sexual purity, or blamed for the impotence of their husbands. Others were sent to remote convents, their names erased from court documents, their portraits painted over. Yet these women still found ways to bend the system. They built networks of spies within their households, carried coded messages embroidered into silk hems, bribed physicians, and conducted clandestine affairs under the noses of kings too distracted or too arrogant to notice. Their allies were often other women, nurses, ladies-in-waiting, aging governesses who remembered their charge not as royalty, but as frightened girls stolen from home and remade into living symbols. The sisterhood that grew behind castle walls was not always kind, but it was necessary, because in the end, no one else would protect them. But power is a poison that seeps into the blood, and some queens learned to love it more than survival. Take Empress Theodora, not a medieval monarch, but a Byzantine courtesan turned ruler centuries earlier, who famously said she would rather die a queen than live without her crown. Or Catherine de' Medici, who ruled France from the shadows, lacing her court with spies and poisoners, using astrology, sorcery, and silence to outwit her enemies. These were women who turned history's gaze back upon itself, who became the very monsters they were warned against, not because they were born evil, but because they were born powerless, and they refused to stay that way. By the time Isabella died in 1358, the world had already begun to change. The Black Death had torn through Europe like a divine scythe, leveling kings and beggars alike. Faith fractured. The old nobility crumbled, and the peasants, for the first time, began to whisper of their own worth. Yet even as the world shifted, the old ways clung on in the corridors of power. Queens were still crowned to breed, still silenced when they dared to think, their lives still balanced on the edge of daggers held by men who had never bled as they had bled. But Isabella left behind more than scandal. She left behind a son who became one of England's greatest warrior kings, a boy who had seen firsthand how a queen could survive the unthinkable. She left behind documents, letters, a ledger of royal vengeance scrawled in ink and sealed with a crown. And she left behind a legacy buried in half-truths. Was she a traitor who murdered her husband in cold blood? Or a mother who did what she had to in order to protect her son from a kingdom that had already consumed too much of her soul? Was she a she-wolf, or simply a child who had learned too young how sharp the world could be? The chroniclers could never decide. But the silence of her cell at Castle Rising speaks louder than their ink ever could. Even today, her story pulses beneath the stones of England's ancient castles and in the bloodlines of monarchs who pretend not to remember. But history does not forget. It watches, it waits, it whispers, and if you listen closely, late at night, beneath the cold breath of a dying candle, you might still hear her footsteps echoing down the halls, soft, steady, unbroken, like the heartbeat of a woman who refused to be erased.